Well, again, welcome everyone. Thanks for joining us today. It's a really interesting presentation. I think really timely considering that we've already seen our first impactful hurricane, to be specific, this year, this hurricane season. So we're going to be talking about how you can use artificial intelligence and data to help better prepare your supply chain for hurricanes and typhoons. And so I think we have a really interesting presentation for you today and a cast of characters to join me. So why don't I do some introductions? So today's speakers, there's myself. I'm also the host, John Bovitt with Resilinc. I also have Sumit Vakil, who's our founder and chief product officer. And special welcome and thank you for Christopher Wolf joining us from Western Digital, where he heads their digital procurement team. And thanks again, and we'll dive right in. Before we get started, just a couple of notes for housekeeping purposes. The slides will be sent out to you after the presentation is completed. Please reserve your questions. We welcome your questions. Please reserve them towards the end so we can get them and answer. If we run out of time, we'll follow up with you via email. And if you have any other questions or need anything after the event, feel free to contact me at jon.bovitt, B-O-V-I-T, @resilinc.com. From an agenda perspective, today we have a couple of key points we wanted to go through. First, what are some of the key learnings that we've had from past experiences? We've been doing this for a long time, been working with lots of clients globally, and so wanted to give you kind of give everyone sort of a primer on what's happened in the past and what are some of the key learnings from that. And then Christopher is going to cover, from Western Digital, is going to cover some of his experiences and what Western Digital does to prepare and some of the newer strategies that they're using. And then Sumit will bring us home around what the Resilinc solution is specifically and some of our newer capabilities. And then we'll wrap up. We have, you'll want to stay to the end. We have a couple of special offers for everybody today. So I'll cover that at the end. So hope you'll stay with us towards the end. So let me jump into what are some of the learnings from the past. And the idea here is, especially for hurricane preparedness, there's a lot you can learn from past years and the experiences that everyone has gone through. So why don't we cover some of that? If you even looking back just a couple of years, 2017 was, we can all say was a very brutal year for hurricanes. In fact, some of the largest events that year were Hurricane Harvey, Irma, and Maria, just to name a few, but there were others. And this year, although we hope won't rival the damage that was done that year, is projected to be still an average to above average year. So quite a number we expect of named hurricanes. And if you look at it from a supply chain perspective, Hurricane Maria had a very large impact because it was felt and kind of knocked out Puerto Rico for quite a while, as everyone's probably aware. But if you looked at Hurricane Harvey, it had by looking at the sites and the parts was just a huge impact, and then Irma, same thing, rivaled that one. So just a very, very big year looking back historically. If you look at 2017 by the numbers, which I like to do when talking about these types of things, the estimated losses just in the U.S. was around 200 billion. Puerto Rico was, and they're actually, I don't know if this includes them restoring power and then losing it again. They've had other power outages as they look to upgrade and fix things, but they were out for nearly a year, in many parts even longer. And if you look at some of the surveys around, did company executives think they were prepared? 60% said they weren't. And even higher percent, 68% said they really want to focus on their supply chain risk strategy to be better prepared. So hopefully, since that year was so bad, I know a lot of companies have looked at improving, and so we've invested working with our customers quite a bit in this area. So as we'll cover that as we go through more. If you looking at the map, when we put this together, you can really see things pop out at you, whether it was Hurricane Nate or Hurricane Ophelia, which hit Europe, Harvey, as I mentioned, Storm Franklin, and then you look at the typhoons that were very impactful that year. It was a pretty active year, and that's why it's definitely a good planning tool to look at what happened that year so that you can be adequately prepared, because hopefully that's a worst case scenario, but it's always good to use that as a benchmark for planning purposes. And if you think about the things that we've learned from that year in particular, it was that from a supply chain perspective, it's not good enough to just think about your most strategic or critical suppliers. It's just not adequate. If you look at what impacted a lot of companies, the IV bags, particularly in life sciences, was very impactful, and those weren't necessarily considered the quote most critical suppliers or most strategic suppliers, but it had by far, whether it was the FDA or the CDC or government agencies, FEMA, or just public and private companies, that had a very big impact. And Hurricane Harvey really crippled a lot of industries because of its flooding of the Houston area. I was actually just watching another show where Hurricane Harvey came up because the show's topic was impacted during Hurricane Harvey, and just whether it was the police, normal activities, or other types of company activities were just crippled because of what was going on. People couldn't get to work and so forth. So it was very interesting to look back and think about those impacts. And the other thing to keep in mind, this is another key lesson learned, is your supplier's preparedness is your concern. Do they have enough fuel replenishment contracts to ensure backup power? Do you know if they do or not? This is a key lesson learned. Have they established their capabilities to continue manufacturing to support in case of another hurricane or storm or flood? Including people, communications, command and control from a company perspective, these are kind of key areas. And there's some other things around planning is, well, how many sites, if they do need they go down and they do need to play catch up, how many shifts are actually possible at that site? How long will it take them to ramp up additional staff? Can they actually get additional staff? Where would they pull them from? These are all kind of key lessons learned from some of the ones that I've talked about. And we do like to use this Biogen case study as one of our clients, and it was a very interesting case study, which we actually have the write-up, and we recorded another webinar going back after back in 2018 timeframe, and where they were able to, because of the capabilities and having the pre-planning and the preparation, they were able to move very quickly ahead of Hurricane Maria and ensure that no patients were denied treatment. And again, it was around the IV bags, and they were actually able to very quickly respond, as I said, and avoid risk. And because they had a lot of preparations already done, they had a lot of their mapping and products and knew where they were able to, once the storm was forecasted in its path, we're able to look at what is in the path and take corrective action, move things around, move people around, inventory and so forth, and it actually helped them avoid disruption. So I think it's again, from looking back at sort of best practices and what I think everybody should think about going into this hurricane season, as well as future years. Now's the time to carefully think about this. Now, recently, there was some published research that University of Maryland did, and what's interesting is that it was the focus of the research combined Resilinc data with climate, going back 19 years of climate data, and they looked at where are some of the sites in the supply chain that had a huge climate variability. So how often the climate goes from extreme, gets hit with extremes. And then they also looking at which sites had, according to our customers, had high revenue at risk. So they looked at all of this data. And if you look at these, what's interesting, if you look at this map that I have up here, you'll see a lot of the sites are actually in high hurricane zones, potential zones. Look at Florida. Look at the Hurricane Barry that just hit. There were sites that are in there. So you can see that not only are we, and that's the other thing too to keep in mind. I think one of the other lessons learned is that it's not really enough to just plan out the sites, but to look at the magnitude. Look at Hurricane Harvey, that just unprecedented flooding, and I think we're starting to see where the magnitude of some of these events. There may only be four events this year that have an impact, but they could have huge impacts. So it's definitely worth thinking about. Now, what I wanted to do as well was I polled a number of people and customers and others, and looked at some of the key lessons learned from past years. And I think these are some things that if you can check the box and or at least you understand some of these areas, I think it'll definitely help you in your planning. So one of the other keys too is that assume that your competitors are calling suppliers after an event. They're trying to grab inventory and capacity, people, and be prepared as well. So once these things start to happen, you're competing with some of your competitors to grab these available resources and inventory. So just keep that in mind. And you're not just competing with your own competitors, you're also competing with, not for inventory, but also things like freight movement, as I mentioned, people and resources. And also the ones that are also, need to also get in there are the government agencies, whether it's FEMA or others. And so, things can get pretty congested pretty quickly. And I think the other thing too is to move with speed. Responding quickly and decisively, having your plans already in place was a key success for a lot of companies to avoid impacts. The other thing is make sure that you have clear lines of communication to the suppliers. And that is stored in a readily accessible area. One of the things that we learned was that if you're depending on a particular person, like a supplier manager or commodity manager, to make that contact, what if they become unavailable? In other words, they get their communications go down for where they are. You need to be able to have the contact information in one place. And be able to initiate daily executive briefings. I think one of the key lessons learned is that, being able to mobilize and get everyone on the same page from a high level on down is just critical. And also from not only your internal executives, but also your key customers and your customers and their executives is a key, key lesson learned. And I think one of the things that we notice, if you look at the impacts, they don't necessarily happen right away. One of the things that you'll see when you analyze the impacts from these larger events is they start to unfold. It's not day one. If you look at Hurricane Harvey, the flooding just took days, but it kept coming and getting worse, and thus the impacts, continued. And then the other thing that we've learned too, and we like to do these types of events and get people together and communicating, is to build this community, because you can learn a lot from speaking to others, other peers, other companies, and including other industries. And that's one of the reasons we wanted to have Christopher speak today, to give you some of his experiences. And then finally, just some checklist items to think about when an event is happening and starting to happen, like Hurricane Barry just occurred, and then there's going to be others that are happening, is being able to quickly understand and ascertain and assess which suppliers are in the area, what are the upstream and downstream dependencies, do you have single-sourced components, and especially for those, but for all of your all of your products, do you have alternate sources and sites that are outside the impact zone? What about transportation? What's the transportation going to be like in the impacts? Because what if transportation routes are also impacted? And then what is the capacity at the freight companies? If have you pre-talked to them to understand what the options are given certain scenarios? And then some of the key teams that you want to make sure are involved is procurement, supply chain, and logistics in particular, and the executive teams and the business units as well. And then some of the things, in order to execute a plan of action, you want to be able to understand how you can shift supply out of the region. I know Biogen and many of our customers dealt with that situation, and you kind of pre-planned it ahead of time, including as I mentioned, the alternate transportation routes, having inventory available that you can have outside the impact area to be able to move in and out, but again, puts weight more on the transportation and freight. And then understand your communication plan with customers and their contacts at the customers. So I think these are, some kind of lesson learned and things to keep in mind as you look at past events and looking for planning for the future. Okay. So with that, Chris, I'm going to turn it over to you.
All right, awesome. Thanks, John. Can everybody hear me?
Yes, we can hear you.
Okay, awesome. So, kind of to John's point, right, taking this from Western Digital's perspective and what we've kind of done, just a brief history. One of the major impetuses for Western Digital a long time ago back, and in starting our early formative relationship with Resilinc was the Thailand flooding, right? And so we, kind of the whole storage industry learned from that. But over the years, as we've come to integrate more and more subsidiaries like, HGST, SanDisk, and become a global storage company in all sectors, we've kind of embraced a cohesive risk task force to make things more integrated, right? It's not just enough to have procurement say, well, yeah, there's going to be risk over here, or have something after the fact where the risk presentation's like, yep, that sure was some hurricane. You have to have a risk review team, really, that's cross-functional and whose output is really a system of systems that daily can provide, even down to a tactical level, or, if anybody asks, anybody from CEO down to a new hire, what's our risk posture, what do we plan to do, and how do we communicate that? And also, this is very beneficial from the point of view of working with Resilinc and Resilinc's platform, because doing this gets to let you visualize a lot of the risk factors. For example, to John's point, logistics and supply chain, right? I mean, if you turn back the clock a little bit, some of the presentations, everybody talks about procurement risk or supply chain risk, supply and demand, but I don't think there was too much of a spotlight put on, for example, logistics and shipping. Can you have a lot of parts in vendor-managed inventory? Yes. But if your carrier in the region is maxed out, they're not really going to do you all that much good, and you've just had your vendor pay for a bunch of parts that are just going to stay on hand. So really the visibility brought from all cross-functional vectors into one risk review team in a collaborative basis gels really well with Resilinc and enables the sort of end-to-end approach we've adopted now in WD, certainly for procurement, logistics, and supply chain. Next slide, please. Okay. So kind of continuing on that cause and effect theory, it's important. You know, one of the outgrowths of this is I think it's important to realize that Resiline gives you the visibility into your supplier network, not just your chain, your network. And you know, the whole IV bag scenario, like, why are articles published about it? Why does it all of a sudden, you know, Puerto Rico goes down, who cares, right? And it's because nobody can get IV bags anymore. So it's one of these things that all of a sudden where a big static risk becomes dynamic. So if you can have your experts go through and use Resilinc as a tool and use their own expert knowledge as a way to connect cause and effect, you can begin to build basically a causality network to correlate to map to your supply network. I mean, this is just one example, right? Like, let's say I have two suppliers. You see their site mapping in Thailand, and one's got only one site in the Philippines. A typhoon rolls over, mostly hits the Philippine site. Only one of the Thailand sites is minorly impacted, but you know, supplier B has warehouse inventory. Supplier A can use two carriers, and so on and so forth. So if you look at the final joint probability distribution of all of these events as they occur, you begin to understand some of the nonlinearities in your supply chain and what to focus on. Clearly, if you just go in and look at the network, there's this nice network rendering in Resilinc that you can see. If you look at that, you'll say, well, how can I possibly track all events? And you don't really need to. What you need to do is you need to combine your expert knowledge with what event at what site can cause downstream impacts at other sites you care about in your supply chain. And that's pretty much the philosophy that we use, that we're driving towards. And as a benefit to this really gels well with the artificial intelligence and deep machine learning that you can apply on the back end to help you filter out some of the noise. And in the next slide, we can kind of coalesce that into a few points, right? As the supply network becomes more complex, with more and more interactions, I mean, on average, you're probably going to have, for a large company, like 10 to the 6 interactions. And it just goes up from there. So too will the detailed analysis, right? If you don't filter your event watch, if you don't do any of that, you're just going to see a lot of events, and eventually people will kind of resign themselves to the fact that, yeah, things happen, right? But the benefit of building out this understanding of what causes what, particularly as assisted by Resilinc, is now you get to highlight what matters to you and what matters eventually to your own customers, which you can then communicate to them and demonstrate value add. So in doing this, and I think you'll see in the later slides that Sumit has, AI and machine learning need to be used as assistive and augmented tools that go through this network, look at it, and provide recommendations to your GCMs, not only to increase their own mind share and the mind share of those in your corporation looking at risk, but also to highlight and properly mitigate real risk events as opposed to those where you know that there's not going to be an impact. And again, the end goal and objective should always be towards the refinement of a system that describes what you can do, right? It doesn't really matter if you know there's going to be a typhoon if you can't do anything about it. So the key thing is to focus on the events and the sites you can manage, prepare for those, and then after you've done your preparation processes, you've defined your playbooks, you've defined your risk criteria, then ask yourself, under what type of what-if situations in my supply network, with this knowledge of cause and effect, this causality knowledge, what can I do to minimize my risk to the minimum possible? And if you use that, as we have in WD, as a guiding principle, and if you use Resilinc to sort of visualize your supply network intelligence, so you can see all these things, on a day-to-day basis, you can easily form plans, refine plans, and you can respond to the top 25, the top 50, the top 100 events, depending on the size of your risk review team, that will begin to impact you as a business, right? So this really has, for us, condensed what used to be sort of a very hectic process, very valuable but very hectic process, into something that's streamlined and something that can integrate with other parts of our business, including our demand and supply planning, right? If we know that there's a higher risk in a region, or if a region's going to, is at 5% of their maximum output capacity, we're going to, and demand is going up for that product, we're going to reallocate some things. Likewise, if we see that happening and it's too late to reallocate, we're going to go to customers and see what kind of deals we can make there, both to our benefit and to their benefit overall. Next slide, please. And so when we really put this all together, I think it shows the value of both of this triangle, where you can visualize your risk, where you can communicate effectively internally, and thereby obtain feedback from areas you may not have thought of before when you're just thinking from simply a procurement mindset, right? It can encompass the areas of quality, SQE. We even use Resilinc to do internal BCP audits of internal sites, treating them as internal suppliers, simply because this process is very valuable in producing feedback. And then with this intelligence base of knowledge, you can then actually begin to apply some technology in terms of the automation and AI experience that then reduces the workload on everybody in your risk review team. One of the common barriers or challenges in managing the risk, especially as a corporation becomes larger, and I can tell you this from experience, we went from relatively on the small end of medium to now very large, is the scaling, right? If you just have people staring at a bunch of events, or you start raising red flags 24/7, you get into the whole cry wolf effect. And one of the really good ways to mitigate that is to have a process in place, especially with AI and automation, looking at an event and saying, does this align with my known cause and effect? And if not, is there some way it can? And if not, I don't care about it, right? This is an ideal opportunity for AI and machine learning on the background to really begin customizing all this historical information. And in the slides that you saw that John presented, there's a lot of information historically that you can get of all your supplier tiers and how they were affected previously by typhoons, hurricanes, cyclones, what have you. Going through all this with your human teams is going to be very difficult. But if you encode their knowledge, if you encode their understanding of the situation into an AI backend, you can then have that AI backend begin assisting them in their day-to-day operations. And that we've seen that idea we've seen resonates with the teams as well. So at the end of the day, one of the really big goals that I find Resilinc is positioned quite well for is deploying an automated completion coordination system combined with your internal collaborative environments, whether you use Microsoft Teams, email, whatever, guiding your expert risk review teams to the business relevant conclusions at the end of the day based off of your industry specific knowledge, your company specific knowledge, and even your customer and supplier specific knowledge, which you can then begin taking advantage of and really maximize your value flow. So with that, I think I'll turn it over to Sumit.
Thank you, Christopher. So what I want to do first is, for those of you who are not very familiar with Resilinc solution, provide a brief overview of what the solution looks like, and then I'll do a deep dive on hurricane preparedness and our approach to that. Next slide, please. Okay, so Resilinc, as you probably know, is the industry leader in supply chain resiliency and risk management. Our solution helps you digitize your entire supply chain and get you end-to-end supply chain visibility. Now, one thing that is really important here to understand is that Resilinc is actually able to connect your parts, materials, components, even services with your service vendors to the locations where those services, those manufacturing activities, those warehousing distribution activities are being performed. So the connections that our solution is able to make are very exact and very precise. The solution is cloud-based, and it brings data from a variety of different sources, be they internal, external, and I'll go into more details in the next slide, together in one place. So now you have a single place, a single source of truth, a single point where all your people can go in to access and consume resiliency and risk-related information, and certainly broadly, even broader, other supplier-related information. Built on top of that are our risk analytics that allow you to be proactive in managing risk. And finally, we have our Event Watch solution, which is our event management system, which gives you an up-to-date notification of things that are happening in the world that could impact your supply chain. Here also, it is important to note that what you would get is a customized notification, which is specific to you and your organization, not something generic that, oh, this earthquake happened somewhere, or this factory fire happened somewhere. How we do this is based on, is built on the information that we have. So as I was mentioning earlier, data comes from a variety of different sources, whether it's your own data, which is marked on this slide as customer data, whether it's data that Resilinc has researched, that Resilinc has collected independently and has made available to you, data coming from your suppliers, news that's coming through our Event Watch system, and all the research that we conduct around news. And then any third-party data that you may have, for instance, the financial risk scores that you may have contracted with a third party for, and so on. All of that comes together in one place, and then our analytics and our assessments, our prediction systems are all built on top of that to give you deep insights and intelligence about your supply chain, bottlenecks, risks in your supply chain. Next slide, please. Okay, so using the solution that we have and bringing in cognitive supply chain solutions concepts, we have created this solution for hurricane preparedness. Okay, so while I won't go through every single piece here, some of the key components here are data that Resilinc can license to you. You may or may not have data available to you right away, but you can leverage the data that we already have to make it faster for you to get to a point where you can make decisions about how to deal with hurricane season. Our AI solution for hurricane season, this is what I was talking about earlier, and I will go into more details in subsequent slides. So this is our solution that is prescriptive. It doesn't just throw data at you. It actually gives you recommendations on what to do in specific situations. This, of course, speeds up your response. It speeds up, your ability to get to taking action rather than spending time doing analysis. And then we have a hurricane preparedness survey. We have a business continuity survey. These are things that you can leverage to collect even more information from your suppliers ahead of time, so you are more informed, more knowledge about how to prepare for hurricanes. And then Resilinc also has advisory services available that help you, leverage our expertise in risk and, in event management to help you plan better. Next slide, please. So as Christopher had mentioned, it is very important to package what expertise humans have in terms of for risk and risk management, for responding to events and so on, and package it into software in a way that the software becomes an assistant to you. So the software steps in and says, hey, look, with all this data at your fingertips, with all this information available, where do you start? What are some of the things that you should be doing given the situation? So to design a cognitive system like that, where do you start? So where we started was we did a detailed analysis of how humans prepare for hurricane season. This is the human process, right? This is the cognitive part of it. So let's quickly walk through that. First thing, believe it or not, everybody has to do is figure out where the hurricane region is. Yes, broadly speaking, everybody knows. You know, the south and eastern parts of the United States, the regions around Taiwan, Japan, etc. When it comes to cyclones, which are about the same thing. But when it actually comes down to being a little more exact, where exactly is this on a map? Drawing it out turns out to be non-trivial. You actually have to spend several days just figuring out the region and then teaching yourself how to actually plot those, how to put them on a map, how to overlay them or mix them in with other information you may have about where your own manufacturing or your supplier's manufacturing, warehousing, service operations are. Once you have this, and then the next thing that humans tend to do is then figure out what's in the region. So now you know that the region, now then you go figure out what suppliers are in the region, what manufacturing is happening, how does all this connect back to your own products, what kind of business continuity practices your suppliers have implemented. In the past, if you have reached out to them about events, what have their response rates been like? Have they even gotten back to you saying, yeah, we are impacted, no, we're not impacted? All of that kind of information, even things like contacts. If something happens to a particular supplier, who do I contact? So bringing all of that information together is the next step that humans tend to take. Then they work out some key KPIs that would help them prioritize. As you know, there is just so much data in supply chain, you can't act on everything simultaneously. You have to prioritize. So taking the data that was collected in the previous two steps, creating KPIs out of them, that then lets humans prioritize and categorize information and then figure out what to act on first. Once all of this is done, then the last but one step is for humans to decide on what to do now. Okay, what are the playbooks to put in action? What are the actions to take? And once that has been decided, then they can go into the final step, which is to actually take action. This is where the team is going to create mitigation projects, assign action items, launch surveys, launch outreach to suppliers to collect more information if required. So as you can see, this can become a pretty long, pretty involved process if all you have is humans to deal for humans to have to deal with this. So what we did is we took all the expertise we had, we took all the knowledge we had collected, we talked to experts on how to prepare for hurricane season, and we taught our AI the human cognitive process around hurricane preparedness, and we developed our hurricane preparedness solution. So next slide, please. Okay, so thank you. So what our AI does is, as I mentioned, it has been trained based on how humans prepare for hurricane season. it analyzes thousands and thousands of data points simultaneously. Everything from where manufacturing activity or warehousing service activity is being performed to how long does it take to recover, to business continuity practices, to response rates from suppliers in case of past events, to how often have hurricanes happened for particular sites and so on. All of this is combined together, analyzed, the numbers are crunched by the AI, and then it develops outputs, a set of key performance indicators or KPIs. Based on this information, the KPIs and the data, it of course helps do the prioritization of the highest risk suppliers and sites, but it also then, again, based on the training it's been given, provides recommendations on what the best course of action should be given a particular situation. This is important because not every data point, not every site, not every part, not every supplier has to have the same action applied to them. For instance, there may be a supplier who is very responsive to events and who has a really robust business continuity plan, and they have manufacturing in the hurricane region which constantly gets hit. Though their risk is high, it does because they are responsive, because they have robust business continuity practices, their risk might be lower than that supplier who doesn't even bother to respond. That supplier who has a very weak business continuity plan. So recommendations need to be different depending on the situation, and that's what the AI solution does. It analyzes the situation and provides different recommendations for different suppliers and sites. So the consequence is, once you go into the analytics for hurricane season, you don't have to worry about the previous steps. You go straight to taking action. You can see the highest risk suppliers. You can see the suppliers who have and their sites that have the most likelihood of bringing your operations or impacting your operations. You have a set of actions that are recommended. You can go straight to launching mitigations, launching surveys if you want to collect extra information, and contacting and interacting with suppliers. Next slide, please. Let me show you a few screenshots of the kind of information that gets provided. By the way, the event information, the hurricane information here is based on 7+ years of data that we have collected and that our system analyzes. That is why you will see so many disruptions worldwide that get accounted for and that get used in making the prescriptions, the recommendations. The map, of course, gives you a detailed insight on what the hurricane zones are. Remember what we had talked about earlier, that people actually have to spend a significant effort trying to understand, find out where the hurricane zones are and then plot them on maps. So that's already done for you. Visually, you know now what parts of your worldwide supply chain footprint could get impacted because of hurricanes. Then there are prioritization charts available, like the contour plot on the bottom left corner. It visually gives you, the highest risk, the highest impacting suppliers, those in the top right corner, for instance. So a very quick, easy way for you to prioritize and for you to get started. Those little green boxes on the right-hand side are a set of recommendations that are provided here. If you go to the next slide, then we get more granular, go down to an individual site level. So every site in the region of impact gets analyzed, and every site has risk metrics associated with them, and every site gets custom recommendations. Okay, so it is not just at the supplier level, but we get granular and go really down into the site level. Next slide, please. And then based on all of this information, now your team can immediately go into prioritizing steps based on the findings that the AI has presented. you can, take actions like check business continuity of the suppliers, launch the hurricane preparedness survey to collect more information, to make more detailed, decisions. Check your safety stock. Maybe move inventory around. Some of our customers were very successful with this approach, this inventory movement approach last year, where ahead of time, based on the analysis that they had done for likely impact, they had moved some inventory out of Puerto Rico. So whatever your situation is, based on the information that the AI presents, you should be able to go to the next steps. Okay. The system also, because the contacts for the suppliers are right there, lets you quickly and easily contact the suppliers directly from there without having to go search for contact information in a different place. Okay, next slide, please. A little more about taking action, right, once your team has decided what to do. And by the way, that action item assignment and tracking the action items that have been assigned to people can also be done within the system, so you don't have to go outside into a spreadsheet or a different tool to track the work that you need to do to prepare for hurricanes. So dashboards are available, tracking systems are available, AI assignment, action item assignment is available. It's all in one place. Next slide, please. Okay. Beyond the hurricane preparedness solution that we have to offer, right? Beyond what the AI can do, if you wanted to do a deeper drill down of a specific region, let's say, maybe like in this screenshot here, maybe the Florida region is of critical importance and significance to you. So if you wanted to drill down into just that, then you should be able to use our what if scenario planning tool. It's a really simple system. Bring up the map, draw a polygon or a set of polygons over the region of impact, hit submit, and all of a sudden you have the analysis at your fingertips on what your impact could be if something happens in that region. Okay, next slide, please. And finally, assessing supplier business continuity capabilities. I cannot stress enough the significance of this. What we are seeing is you may be prepared, you may have a robust business continuity plan, but chances are pretty good that your supplier doesn't. Okay. We're seeing massive numbers here, right? Look at this, for instance, 27% of sites don't actually have business processes in place, period. Forget good or bad business practices, but continuity processes, they don't have any. 37% of sites don't have backup power generators. This is enormous, right? So being able to understand what your suppliers are doing to plan for contingencies is equally critical in hurricane preparedness season. To continue to talk about the backup power. Hurricanes happen, power is one of the things that goes out the first. If they don't even have backup generators, if they're not even planning for the backup generators, even if they have backup generators, do they have fuel for it? Have they tested the generators? If you don't have that detail, you don't know what the supplier is capable of, or will the supplier even be capable of dealing with a hurricane. All of this information can come out of assessing their business continuity practices. And so this is yet another thing that you can leverage through our system to go deeper into what a supplier is capable of as far as BCP goes. So to summarize, to bring all this together, you start with the Resilinc AI solution, the recommendations that it's making. So it cuts down on the analysis, cuts down on the prep time. You look at the recommendations, then you start taking action, and some of the actions we would recommend are what the AI has, and beyond that, do a deep dive with the what if, and do a deep dive into supplier BCP capabilities. Back to you, John.
Hey, thanks, Sumit. Thanks, Chris. I think that was really insightful. I appreciate everybody. And it looks like nobody left. I don't think anyone left. I think that's a good sign that there's some interesting content. And the other thing that we wanted to do was we know that that there's a lot of people that are interested in getting started, whether they're a current customer of Resilinc and are only using certain capabilities and want to expand to leverage some of the newer features that we've talked about, or new customers, to Resilinc that are interested in assessing and preparing for hurricanes and typhoon season. We wanted to, put together a special offer for everybody. So we did that. And a couple things. So what are we offering at no cost? So for existing customers, and that means we have actually different levels of customers. So we have some that are on Risk Shield or multi-tier customers or our larger customers. What we're offering is, and you've already received this, but just as a refresher, if you're on and you have not seen it, is we're willing to do at no cost to do 25 hurricane preparedness surveys to your suppliers. And if you're a Resilinc Event Watch only client, please contact me. We would need to do some configuration, but we're happy to do that, and there's a number of clients that fall into that category. And the reason that we wanted to do it is that we wanted to help clients for their top riskiest suppliers. In some cases, obviously doing all of your suppliers would be best, but at least getting started, seeing the data that you can get and seeing the responsiveness for your top suppliers, top riskiest suppliers would be great. So we're offering that at no cost. And the other thing that we did was recently is we packaged all the solution components that Sumit had talked about into something that we're calling the Resilinc Comprehensive Hurricane Assessment Program. And I didn't put specific pricing on and packaging, but if someone is interested, let me know. There is a cost for this. But we really would want to get a lot of clients and a lot of, whether they're current clients or future clients, utilizing this comprehensive solution. It would leverage all the AI, the data, the services, the monitoring, and we would love to get everyone using it. We think it's a very comprehensive program to help you plan both, in the current hurricane season as well as future hurricane season. And, leveraging the capability that Chris had mentioned and all the new features that Sumit had talked about. So those are some of the special offers, and please contact me, if you're interested or you have any questions, or if you're an existing customer, you'll have your client success manager. Feel free to contact them, and we can answer questions that you may have. So I think we've successfully taken up most of the hour, and I think we have seen some questions. If we don't have time to, as I mentioned, I'll follow up with you and answer your questions directly. But again, thanks everybody for listening in today. We will follow up with a copy of the presentation, and why don't we? I think we have time maybe for one question. I think, and I think the first question is actually a very good one. Chris, if you're still there, I think a good question for you to respond to. If you were giving people advice on the best way to get started in hurricane preparedness based on your experience, what would that be? Do we have you muted?
Yeah,
Oh,
thanks. So from a business perspective, or from the risk perspective, or from using Resilinc, or all three?
It wasn't specific, so maybe just however you want to address it.
I think what I would recommend, if someone were interested in that, is first gather together your cross-functional leads, and of course the typical, set up a topic and whatnot, but also then set up what I like to call the brainstorming sessions, like off the norm, storm, inform model, and look at the network, then document and code what these different experts believe can happen there. Go into Resilinc, do the what ifs, and categorize your top the top risks to your suppliers. And then also, if you have access to it, look at the hurricane preparedness tool and see where they fall on that quadrant heat map. I think that's one of the best ways to go, and right now anyway, deploy it in a business actual setting to realize the results. And I think specifically what we look to in the future for using this at Western Digital is to enable a lot of that process with the AI, and also make the probabilistic network or graph feature more visible to the cross-functional experts in our team already using Resilinc. And I think that will enable the sort of risk topology surgery, or this instant what if and prescriptive recommendations that John, that you and Sumit were talking about earlier, in a sort of a day-to-day business workflow.
Great, thank you. Thanks, Chris. I think that was a great response. And hey, I think we're going to wrap up. We're near the end of the hour, and there are several other questions I see, but I'll follow up with you directly. Apologies around that. Again, thanks everybody. If you have any other feedback or requests for future presentations, please also let me know. With that, I think we will close it down. Thank you again. Thanks, everybody.
Yeah.